Welcome to the PsychopharmaStahlogy Show, a special NEI podcast series. In this show, Dr. Andrew Cutler interviews Dr. Stephen Stahl on the most controversial, novel, and exciting topics in psychopharmacology today.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the PsychopharmaStahlogy Podcast. Working on a series here now of psychedelics for psychopharmacology. And with us today is a good friend, Dr. Chuck Raison. Chuck, how you doing?
I'm okay. Good to see you, Andy. Nice to see you.
Good to see you. And of course, Dr. Stephen Stahl, as always. Steve, how are you?
I'm fine, guys.
Well, Chuck, I understand you were part of a study recently using psilocybin for depression. Can you talk a little bit about this study, which was recently published?
Mm-hmm. Sure. So the study you're talking about was published in JAMA. It came out just around September 1st. It was a phase 2 study, and it was looking at the antidepressant effect of a single 25 milligram dose of pharmaceutically produced psilocybin, and the comparator condition in this case was niacin. Niacin was something that was used in in the early 2000s in some of the first studies. It causes a little bit of flushing, and when we first went to the FDA, they liked it because they thought that might help with blinding. So we gave people 100 milligrams of niacin, which is not thought to have any behavioral effects. There's a couple of interesting things to say about the study, because now there have been a couple of these larger studies. When we went to the FDA originally, we were really interested in looking at psilocybin potentially as a treatment for people facing the end of life with cancer, because the field really kicked off in 2016 when Steve Ross and his crew and Roland and his crew at NYU and Hopkins published these small academic studies showing this huge effect from a high dose of psilocybin that persisted for like 6 months, right? But the FDA doesn't really have a basket for that. And so we came out of that, and this is now, 5-6 years ago, with a sense that probably the parsimonious thing to do would be to look at major depression more generally. Now, interesting, USONA, which doesn't always get a lot of press in the psychedelic sort of pharmaceutical development world, right, is an interesting entity because it is a medical research organization, but it's nonprofit. So it really now is the last kind of nonprofit in this space. And that is in itself a fascinating thing about a nonprofit trying to develop a drug. But anyway, we selected not TRD, but MDD. So one of the interesting things about the study was that these people came in, they had to meet criteria for major depressive disorder. It had to be persistent for 60 days. They had to have a MADRS score greater than 28 for the nerds in the audience. That's, you're getting pretty darn depressed if you've got a 28. And then they couldn't improve by more than 30% between the screening and when we actually, got ready to dose them. And so these folks the average pre-dosing depression score was 35, which is really at the edge of the standard cutoff for severe depression. Half the people in a blinded, and I'm making little air quotes here, fashion, got to 25 milligrams of psilocybin. Half the people got to 100 milligrams of niacin. The treatment was delivered within what's called a standard set and setting protocol, meaning that we didn't just bring them into a room and give them the pill. They spent 6 to 8 hours with the 2 facilitators that were with them that day beforehand. They had 2 people with them for the dosing session. Then they had a couple of what are called integration sessions where they met for an hour or so, the facilitators and the subject, and sort of talked about the experience. We looked at their depression scores a day later, a week later, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks later. And the results were that the people that got the high dose of psilocybin had a very kind of profound drop in their depressive symptoms. They got, on average, a 19-point drop in the MADRS, which, there's depression studies where people get 16, 17, 18 points. So it's not that this is like a different thing, but that's a robust drop. It was fully apparent within a week. But one of the interesting things there were a couple of interesting things about the findings that, in contradistinction to some of the treatment-resistant depression studies, the effect did not drop over the subsequent 6 weeks. The effect was as large at 6 weeks as it was at 1 week. So there was this interesting persistence of effect with the dose. Now, the population also did not have a high degree of sort of standard treatment resistance. So only 13% of the population met the criteria of having failed, 2 adequate trials or, 1 plus an augmenter. That's a small group, but there was a pretty clear signal that those people did not do as well. That they did not get they got like a 14-point drop, which is still nothing to sneeze at, right?
Yeah.
It's all right, Yeah. So it's interesting. So that's, and the side effect profile was what we tend to see. It causes people to have a number of side effects acutely. There were a couple of people that endorsed still having some perceptual abnormalities for a few days afterwards. There were no serious, official serious side effects. Nobody died or anything like that associated with the treatment. So that's sort of what we found.
Wow. And I'm assuming there was a little bit of an effect with niacin, almost a placebo-like effect.
Okay. So,
the separation was still amazing.
The separation was huge. But, so if we want to critique these studies, look, obviously the first thing we can say is that you can't really blind a 25 milligram psilocybin dose, right? That's just not possible. Well, we can talk about that. You can. We're trying, but you have to do some really weird and interesting things. In these sort of, pharma development studies, no, you can't do that.
It's very hard. Yeah.
The other thing to note is that, when the FDA is really, all they're interested in is placebo-adjusted effect size, meaning they want to know how much better something does against placebo, not how much better it does against where the people started, right? So, some of the studies that have died on the rocks recently have died because people had like a 14, 15-point MADRS placebo response. Man, you should package that, right? You could make millions of dollars on a thing that has no side effects and gives you 15 points on the MADRS. So the niacin gave us about 6 points drop, which is, it's about what Compass Pathways saw with their TRD study. They did a 1 milligram low dose psilocybin comparator. Right. So we got some movement. But when you see these, we got like a 12-point separation from placebo. Now, if you got an antidepressant, if you got a new antidepressant pill with a 12-point separation from placebo, you need you need 3 people sitting in the shade to show a difference, right? I mean, that would be, but that's because, you don't get as big a placebo response. Now, it's interesting. If you look at our paper in JAMA, they required us to put in something called a waterfall graph, which I had never heard of, but I will never do another clinical trial without putting one of these in, because it actually shows the raw data. It's like these little spaghetti strands dropping down, right? Yeah. If you look at that figure, I think it was figure 2, panel B, you can see that there were some people in that placebo group that went all the way to 0 on their MADRS. Man, it was a miracle cure. But you also see that there's some people in the placebo group whose scores got worse. There's a couple of people in the psilocybin group whose scores got worse. But it's very clear that on average, it's orange versus blue. The orange psilocybin scores drop way, way more.
Right.
So, even though you couldn't really blind it, you still get a placebo response.
Well, congratulations. That is tremendous. And it adds to the literature now that is emerging on psilocybin and various psychedelics. Some people have tried, just to the methodology, some people have used, for instance, blinded raters. But it's still hard to blind because the rater's talking to the patient might talk about their experience. And,
we use blinded raters, but the patient, the problem is, it helps, right? But it's not adequate.
Yeah, you can't completely.
Yeah, you can't. So now what the FDA is really bullish on is getting expectancy and then having people guess there, And, there is a whole literature on this. There's a really, there was an interesting recent study from the group that's sort of hostile to antidepressants, but pulling up all the bunch of data on teens and showing that, many people could guess correctly, and guesses actually strongly predicted outcomes. So going forward, what's interesting is one of the things psychedelics are doing that's interesting is they are changing the field of psychiatry a little bit too, right? So because you can't blind it, now I think what we'll find is that probably, requiring participants to guess what they got is going to become part of almost all the studies that are done going forward.
There's a good friend of mine, Mark Opler, who runs a rater sort of training company that has been doing a lot of work on this and has a survey and has some data published on that as well. So you're right. Just for us clinical trial geeks, that's interesting.
Yeah, cool.
Steve, what do you think so far?
Well, I've always been skeptical that at least the hallucinatory experience is therapeutic. I haven't been so skeptical that the drug, maybe through neuroplasticity, can cause something. But I don't see a pathway to approval or commercialization. I think that this may be something that's headed in the direction of being like cannabis treatments, which are not really approved and have some data for them, et cetera, et cetera. I don't really see how this can happen. I mean, how many doses can you take of psilocybin before you get valvulopathy? Is anybody going to do echoes on these patients? I think it's just not made for an FDA world. And it may very well change psychiatry, but I see it being basically going into a practice realm where, in Australia and in Oregon, it's legal. So I actually don't see a company doing this. I don't see any profits from it. I see it can change practice, and I think that the blinding things are insurmountable. But having said that, Chuck, I think that I'm looking for one possibility, which is the FDA is in the old school is ruining psychiatry by evidence-based trials in a certain way because of the placebo response rate and whatever the hell is going on with that. And I'm wondering, there's a number of revisions to a way in which medicines can be proved that might actually be ushered in by this kind of dilemma that you're discussing yourself. And it's things like post-randomization adjustments. For example, you can't, as a statistician, take people who've been randomized but stop their drugs, and if they're not on the drug, take them out of the efficacy trial. And you can't stop people who took another drug on top of the drug in the placebo group, and you find that out to drop them out because this, holy grail of not changing things after randomization. But without some way of trying to look at the reality of this, it has already killed development of drugs by big pharma. Big pharma just says screw it. You can't get there from here. And so all the entrepreneurial small groups are doing it. So maybe that will come out of this. But what I'm hoping, Chuck, is quite different. I'm a psychopharmacologist. I'd like to see people figure out how to take the hallucinatory experiences out of it and keep the neuroplastic experience in it, which there are any number of companies, Longboard, Delix, a lot of little companies are doing that. That's the way forward to make a drug out of it, a drug you can give more than once or twice, and actually not have an unblinding. So I think that those two things are where I see it going. The other one, I see this as being part of psychotherapy, and don't get mad at me, Chuck, but possibly witchcraft, and I'm teasing. But so I just look at it and say, interesting, where's this going? Is it a drug? And I'm not sure it's a drug.
Well, Chuck, a lot to respond to there.
Oh, huh? Yes. So you're going to be surprised, Steve. I almost completely agree with you.
I'm surprised.
Oh yes, I completely. In fact, I wear a bunch of hats, right? And one of the hats I wear is I'm a professor at the University of Wisconsin, and we have a psychedelic center. And our work is trying to exactly figure out this question of whether or not the psychedelic experience is required. And we could talk about how we're doing it. This is a very sad day for me. We ran. I'd have to tell you, we're doing a very weird and novel study that is probably going to fail. But we're trying to disentangle the psychedelic experience from the neuroplasticity. And we've got some interesting findings, some of which I could talk about. But first off, let me circle back to what you said at first. Yes, I think this is going to be incredibly difficult to commercialize.
Right.
And I think it's going to be difficult to commercialize for some of the reasons that you said. Now, I think I'm not as pessimistic as you are about the FDA. I think actually MDMA, which is sort of a psychedelic, is going to be approved this year. But whether you can make a buck on this stuff, yeah, man, I don't know, because maybe, my buddy Rob Barrow at MindMed, they just did the LSD GAD study, and they really tried to reduce the psychotherapeutic aspect. Maybe that would help with cost effectiveness. One of the interesting things about USONA, it's a nonprofit, and so it'd be an odd thing if it turned out that this could only actually eventually run on some sort of nonprofit basis if the FDA approved it. But yeah, commercialization.
Do you see the same thing for ecstasy and PTSD?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, they've got an interesting issue because it's going to be approved with 12 weeks of psychotherapy. So cooked into that. Rick Doblin always had this, that it was psychedelic-assisted therapy. So to your point, witchcraft maybe, that we could talk about that. That's a risk, actually. Sometimes people, when they go off the deep end with this stuff,
That's right.
But this idea that it may be more like psychotherapy than it is like pharmacology is a really interesting idea, because I would argue that there are in fact aspects of the treatment that actually do resemble psychotherapy. So you can do a thought experiment. Would psychotherapy work if you did it with an unconscious patient? And the answer is we think not, right? We think that psychotherapy, when it works, has something to do with the processing of conscious awareness, right? So you could ask yourself, well, would psilocybin work if you were unconscious?
Exactly.
And so that's the studies we're doing.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
And the answer may be that you can't easily make people unconscious and get the effects of psilocybin. It has very, I'm a reductionist, which should please you. I don't think that there's a separate soul wandering out there. I think that, if you look at what these agents do, they clearly have powerful, in animals at least, they have powerful neuroplastic effects. But,
exactly.
You come in, you're all depressed, you take this thing, the drug is in your body for 8 hours, and then you have this profound experience, and then you feel different for some extended period. Well, there must be a biology. That drug must be doing something in that 6 hours that's setting something else in motion. And so the question is, can the drug do that something, whatever it is, without producing conscious experiences, even as a byproduct? I mean, if you want to be really, like what they call like an illusionist or an epiphenomenologist, it doesn't necessarily mean that the consciousness is causal, but the consciousness may be strapped to the biologic effects that you want, that whatever it is that's activating then these downstream, longer-term effects. And this is what my whole research career is about. I'm obsessed with that question. Then I'll comment on legalization. Yes, and Colorado is more. One of the places I hang a hat is out in Vail. We have a behavioral health innovation center out there. And part of the reason that was founded is
no, you don't. You have a ski center out there. Don't give me that stuff.
I don't even ski anymore. That's what's so pathetic. But it is not so painful to have to go out to Vail every once in a while.
Yeah, exactly.
But legalization in Colorado is going to be different than legalization in Oregon. It's way more wide open, and they're going to set up healing centers where people that have a medical license, if they're willing to take the ride, can actually treat people. And so you're right, Steve, that one of the challenges that's going to face commercialization is that it's not going to, you can't sell it out there. It's not going to be like cannabis that way, but it may be that legalization becomes a route at which this occurs. Now, there's a problem with that, which is people are going to be charged $4,000, $5,000, $6,000 for a session. Right. So it's going to only be for people with cashola, which is kind of a heartbreak, right? And one of the weird things I say is that, my work with USONA is it may not be so relevant for Oregon and Colorado, but it may be relevant if we ever get approval for Southern Georgia, where I used to hang a hat too. Mm-hmm. Places where people are going to want to see some sort of FDA approval and more of a medical model. Right. But it is an intriguing thing, and trying to understand, how does something that's in your body for 8 hours do this? Is really kind of a mystery. And can you separate out the consciousness? I'm a huge fan of this guy, David Olson, who's the Psychedelics guy, because he's getting at the question from the same angle, right? Because if it's possible to find some molecule that you take it home on Saturday morning, right? Nothing happens. You wake up Sunday and you go, oh my God, wow, I love life. I need to go back to church. I should exercise more often. I don't know why. I just feel different, and if that lasts for 5 or 6 months and then you start feeling a little bit crappy again, and you go back in, well, you forget the whole psychedelic thing. That's the end. Yeah, right. Everything that we're talking about is gone, right? Because that is what our, But
the opposite thing is, Chuck, I've had not countless, but many patients come to me say, "Oh my God, Stahl, did I have the most incredible experience on ayahuasca?" I mean, I talked to my dead mother, and she forgave me, and I felt good, and I transformed, and whatever, and I saw lights and whatever, and then on and on and on. And numerous patients have said that, and then I say, "Well, why are you in my office for treatment-resistant depression?" So I don't take it that there isn't a profound experience. I'm not just sold on the fact that it's consistently or causally therapeutic, or like you would say, I get sedated on an atypical antipsychotic. Is that why my hallucinations go down? No, I see it as a side effect. So right. To be reductionist, even worse than you, Chuck, how about if you have 5-HT2A receptors that are linked in different signal transduction pathways, right, such that some of them in some parts of the brain lead to hallucinations which are unwanted, and others in other parts of the brain lead to neuroplasticity, and they have a rapid onset of therapeutic effects. So I'm hoping that's the case. I'm open-minded. I just hope we find new stuff that works. But I don't want to see us go to, I keep mentioning Joel Dimsdale's book. Have you read that? He's one of the professors at UCSD, now retired. Right. It's called Dark Persuasion. Right. And Dark Persuasion goes through the lurid history of psilocybin, because other than the Native Americans who used it first, in the modern world, the first people to use it was the CIA, who tried to use it to coerce confessions and to brainwash capitalists or communists into being capitalists, etc. So anyway, I'm teasing in a certain way, trying to be provocative, but I'm very skeptical.
Let me push back on you, Steve, because we already know that the hallucinogenic stuff is not what causes any change. So like seeing stuff, weird stuff, doesn't do anything. What seems to cause change are these sort of powerful emotional experiences. Now, does that mean that you get one and I'm not going to show up in your office again in 6 months? No. This is not a miracle cure. But there is so it's been shown in every study, including ours, that if you ask certain type of questions about the experience people had, the more they say, yes, I had that, the more undepressed they are for extended periods, right? So it's not all the weird lights and weirdo. It is more like psychotherapy in that if people have, so if people see their dead grandmother and it's just weird, nothing happens. If people see their dead grandmother and it makes them feel, liberated or more connected, or some psychological problem is resolved, that's what seems to make them feel better, a lot like psychotherapy, right? So back to the thing about that it might be more like a pharmaceutically induced psychotherapy. But it may be, it may well be the same thing. Of course, the 5-HT2A receptor is going to be linked into all sorts of different brain networks. The question is whether you can stimulate the networks you need to stimulate to induce that kind of neuroplasticity and not have that track with with an experience. That's why this study we're doing, we actually developed IV psilocybin, and we're giving people IV psilocybin in deep sleep. Right. And with the idea that if they can keep sleeping, you're going to get all the 5-HT agonism you want, but there's not going to be any conscious experience, right? And so if people, if people sleep through it and then they wake up in the morning and they go, oh my God, I'm a different person. I don't know what happened, but then it's to you, right? Then we know that it's separable. If they wake up and go, whatever, nothing much happened, that'd be more consistent with, again, not that there's a sort of disembodied soul floating out there, but that at the very least, that sort of conscious experience is a biomarker or a phenomenological marker of that you've hit the funny bone, you've hit that right neuroplastic pathway. We ran our first subject last night, and it was very discouraging because it was this guy, he was a great young guy. He was in the heaviest stage 4 N3 sleep. The guy was unconscious. He told us later. We snuck in to get us. We did something so crazy. we dosed this guy. And about 4 minutes later, man, his eyes flew open. He was like, whoa, I want to talk to somebody. Now, this guy, we sleep deprived him all day. And he was exhausted. He was begging to go to sleep, right? he is up, and he was a quiet guy, right? He is up. He's talking a mile a minute. He is talking about his mom, and he's talking about his life, and he was, there's this thing about spiritual awakening, right? I mean, I thought, oh my God, it's a metaphor. The guy was fully awake, and he wasn't tired after that, and he only slept 3 hours. He woke up in the morning, he said, man, I feel refreshed, Well, it's very discouraging because our goal, of course, is we want to try to see if we can. We're doing a little pilot because none of us, his heart rate went from 60 to 110, right? These agents are activating agents. Yeah. So this study design, we'll see. I'm not ready, it's the first guy. But it speaks to, there's something here, and I'm trying to articulate, which is that agent woke him up and gave him an experience, right? And so the possibility that interests me is that you might not be able to hit those pathways you want to hit, Steve, without that producing a some sort of effect. Now, you could knock people out. Boris Heifetz at Stanford, who you should get him on. He's a great, fascinating guy. He's doing the study that, he's going to give people psilocybin under anesthesia, right? But the problem with that, of course, is that the anesthesia has profound brain dampening things. So how do you know that you're just blocking the neuroplasticity? Exactly. Right? And I'll say one more thing. I can't talk details because we've just submitted it, but we have another study where we're tweaking with this, and we think that we may have blocked the neuroplasticity and not necessarily blocked the psychedelic experience. And we are seeing that it doesn't have the behavioral signal. So stay tuned on this because, we don't know, but this is my life, right? So you've come to the right place, right? I can talk to you all day about exactly what you're saying, and so more to be seen.
Let me just jump in, if I could, for the audience and translate some of what these guys are talking about here. And it's a fascinating discussion. But, we're talking about second-generation psychedelics, is something Steve had mentioned earlier, which would be there are ways to create these drugs that either through biased agonism, through signaling pathways of 5-HT2A or other ways, give you the neuroplasticity without the so-called psychedelic trip. Also it occurs to me, we know that the best outcomes are always a combination of medicine and psychotherapy. So does it have to be this, reductionist either or? Could it be all of the above as well?
Well, it's just how do you approve it? How do you approve it? And so how do you control the experience or bottle it? And, one of the things, again, my neurobiological reductionism to an extreme will go on with this comment. How about the fact that this is the experience, if you will, is a form of allowing reconsolidation? We know, at least the current theories about memory, is that you deposit something in your memory, and maybe that's a bad thing, a self-esteem thing, or whatever it is, and that in the old-fashioned thing, by doing psychoanalytic psychotherapy, you make the unconscious conscious, and you turn neurotic suffering into common what do they call it, common suffering, common despair, or whatever, and so. The idea is, though, if this drug allows you to experience a memory, the theory is that experiencing the memory or the emotional experience creates the ability to modify it. It's labile. Because now you can modify it and then restore it and have it again later and have it again. And maybe people need to take some of those things out of their safety deposit boxes and get them out of their brain. So the way to disrupt it is to not allow reconsolidation of horrific things that are bothering your life. So to the extent that this, quote, emotional experiences is actually inhibiting reconsolidation of crap into your brain, which is causing you misery, then I think that's kind of interesting. I guess the question is, how can you make sure that psychotherapy doesn't do that instead of have sex with you and whatever? So the reality is the ability to abuse someone in this twilight state even through just incompetence, let alone malfeasance, is there while you actually say, but it has the opportunity to stop reconsolidation of misery and to cure you. So these are just kind of questions. I don't have answers for them. I'm just giving you a hard time, Chuck.
No, but that's actually close to what I think happens, right? So Roland Griffiths, who was an interesting guy years ago, said, hey, you know what? Look at post-traumatic stress disorder, right? You're going along in your life, you're all right. Then something horrible. It's horrible, it's unexpected, it's shocking, right? It happens. And then you're never the same after that, right? And there's a little bit, you remember Michael Moss, these guys, they did this interesting study where there was this horrible nightclub fire in Germany. And they did a study of people afterwards and showed that the drunker you were, the less PTSD you got, right?
Wow.
Can you get PTSD for a horrific thing that happens that you're not aware of, right? Psychedelics
a similar study was with morphine on the battlefield.
Yeah.
That if you had an injury and you got morphine within an hour of the injury, you didn't get PTSD compared to people.
Exactly.
Right.
Wow.
So think about psychedelics as reverse PTSD, right? That they are essentially doing this sort of, you're exactly right, that they're disrupting these old patterns. I mean, this is the sort of, like Robin, I know you guys have been had it out with Robin, I heard about that,
Yeah. Robin Carter
this would be what he would say, right? I mean, I think that basically, it's producing this plastic state that allows for this. So we're interested in this. Another study we're doing actually is we're going to try to pair vagus nerve stimulation with psychedelic treatment to see if we can't enhance that sort of critical period, open, what we want to do is reconsolidate memories in a different way, right? So, you said it, right? The classic is, I had a horrible childhood. Now my dead mom comes to me and she says, son, blah, 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 blah. Dead people are, by the way, much better when it comes to psychedelics because dead people tell no tales. People have these extremely compelling, no, I swear to God she was there, right? Kind of experience. And then they've got this sort of, can we reconsolidate that revised sort of narrative about their lives? So there's Mark George has got this business, they got this transauricular vagus nerve stimulation where you can stimulate it through the ear. So we're going to plug people up to that and see if we can't actually enhance the sort of felt salience of the psychedelic experience exactly for the reason you're talking about, Steve,
Yeah. Well, because that has, by the way, I don't know if you want to do that, but I think I got an idea as you said that. This vagal nerve stimulation takes a long latency to work. So I wonder if it might work better if you prepared for it by doing the vagal nerve stimulation in advance, if not much in advance.
We thought of that, and that's one of the arms of the study.
Wow.
That's one of the arms of the study, yes. But now, this is not to digress, but Vegas, per Mark George and some of this interesting stuff, what they're doing now is they're pairing the vagus nerve stimulation with the context that they want to reinforce. And there's some real, as opposed to, in depression, it just goes off. But, it's approved for stroke, and there, they implant it. But the deal is every time you try to move your arm a little bit, if you move it, you get a zap. Zip, zip, zip. And it drives this sort of noradrenergic signaling in hippocampus and amygdala, and it does exactly what we're talking about. So this is a sort of rationale. But again, to the point, though, which is interesting, is that this comes down to the conscious experience. So this is why I am absolutely obsessed with this issue, not for hoodoo-voodoo purposes, but because, Steve, you just stepped at it. That's exactly what I think is happening, and that may be what these agents are doing, and it could completely biological. It could be completely reductionist. It's a different pathway of reductionism than sort of maybe more of a standard daily.
Well, how do you control it then? How do you make sure that you precipitate this emotional experience and maybe not the hallucinations, but the curative or the therapeutic emotional experience, and how do you enhance it, and how do you and not exploit it for bad purposes? I mean, those are the kinds of things that come up.
Well, okay, so not exploited for bad purposes. That's you've got to have rules and regulations to play. That's a different register of questions. Well, my friends out in psychedelic land would say that the mushrooms have an intelligence and they seem to know what to do. People have a variety of experiences, and people have a variety of responses, right? So. Not everybody benefits, right? So there is a small group of people that it's now becoming clear that if you ask them a year later, they'll say, that psychedelic experience, no, it harmed me. Sometimes they'll say, yeah, I did get some benefits, but it harmed me. And then some people get kind of mediocre, and then some people have these profound changes. We know that the profundity of the change, it reliably associates with the characteristics of the psychedelic experience, just not the lights and all the weirdo stuff, the emotional stuff. How can you get people how can you optimize that? Well, that's the idea behind all this preparation and all this stuff, right? And then how can you optimize it if it happens? That's the idea behind the integration. It's more like it is psychotherapy. That's why sometimes people call it, psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. It's an interesting question. One thing that's weird about psychedelics, though, is that there's another kind of metaphorical way of thinking about this sort of phenomenology of it, which is that they seem, so if high density EEG, usually modules in the brain talk more to each other, less across wide distances. With psychedelics, that breaks down, and you get these big, so you get, just sort of metaphorically, these sort of more ancient limbic, where all your emotion is repressed. It all of a sudden pops up, and you can't ignore it, And so people are often brought face to face, not with what they thought they were going to find, but with what they later very much feel that thank you, sir, I needed that. Or, oh my God, I didn't realize that I actually feel grief for my ex-wife who I hate. That kind of stuff, right? But it's so compelling because it's their own brain talking to them that psychedelics are pretty good at this. But by the way, one thing that psychedelics have taught me is, I spent my early years basically as a psychiatrist, meaning that I at UCLA, I saw thousands of psychotic patients a year. This is why people don't stop believing their voices. Right? Because what psychedelics do phenomenologically is they give people the sense that they're getting this information from outside themselves that seems so have so much veracity. Andrew, if you look in the mirror and go, yeah, I'm a good-looking fellow, right? That's okay. But if I say, God, Andrew, you're such a good-looking fellow, it means more to you because we believe things coming. We've evolved to believe things coming from outside of us, right?
Well, you're making me think of a patient, Chuck. It's interesting. I had a patient years ago who said, whatever you do, don't get rid of the voices. They're my friends. Just make them nice.
Because that person thinks the voices are coming from outside, right?
Yes.
Psychedelics do the same thing. People get this sense that if their dead grandma's talking to them, they have this felt sense that, wow, there was something. I did not create that. I didn't think my dead grandma was good. It just happened. Oh my God, just like things happen in real life. Like, I don't know what Steve's going to say next. So, if I knew what Steve was going to say next, I would think that Steve was a figment of my imagination, right? So psychedelics have that same weird effect where your own brain makes you think things you didn't know you were going to think, which is, of course, psychosis also, right?
Well, let me introduce another avenue of the discussion here. I'm very curious about microdosing. And theoretically, with microdosing, you're not getting the full psychedelic experience either. And yet is there not some research on microdosing?
Yeah. So I'm a little bit more like Steve is around psychedelics in general with microdosing. So if you take a bunch of people and ask them, hey, do you feel better now that you're microdosing? They will say, absolutely, this stuff is a miracle. Man, I tried Prozac, Paxil, Zoloft, and oh God, this is great, right? And there's, Jim McFadden, there are a lot of studies that look at that.
Yeah.
What has not been done, and which could be done, because by definition, you're not supposed to know that you took a microdose, is a randomized, appropriately powered, rigorous, FDA kind of study, right? Not been done. There are two studies that I know of, though, that had different designs, and Robin did one of them, where they tried to do a placebo. Harriet DeWitt did the other. But if we think about Robin's, that was the interesting one. So it was sort of like citizen science, right? And so basically you got a fairly good-sized population of people at home to begin microdosing or to do it with a microdose for a placebo, and I don't remember quite how he did that. But the result of that was that, man, microdosing worked great, and just as great, the placebo worked. And in fact, it wasn't whether you were taking the microdose or the placebo that mattered. It was how much you thought you were taking the microdose or the placebo.
Exactly. Yes.
So,
expectancy bias.
So Andy Miller and I did a study years ago where we gave people infliximab for TRD, for treatment of depression.
That was a landmark study. I quote it all the time, Chuck.
One of the things we found was that we gave people 3 infusions of salt water who had pretty robust treatment of depression. Miracle cure. Oh my God, miracle cure. More than 50% had a response. And people came to us and said, oh, you guys are going to get a Nobel Prize. You've discovered a powerful new treatment. The salt water worked better than the infliximab overall. Three treatments of salt water, if you do it with a lot of pomp and circumstance, is a very powerful antidepressant. So
Absolutely.
I think the data are out on microdosing, but I'm going to say one more thing, because NIH is now interested in this. Even if there's a placebo effect with depression and anxiety, it may still induce neuroplastic effects that might be relevant for something like mild cognitive impairment. Right? So we may not be looking at the right thing, even if it's Dumbo's feather for depression. But we'll see. But it could, we haven't done the adequate study yet.
Well, I have two questions about microdosing. One is, can you completely get rid of the psychedelic experience? Because even the one milligram that was used in the COMPASS studies, there was still a little bit of something.
A little bit of funky. But then, there's a great study, and I can't remember now who did it, where they gave people placebo but told them they were getting a psychedelic, and people had a little bit of something. So I don't know.
Just like there was a study years ago, college students, they were getting water, and they were told it was ethanol, and they acted drunk. So
it's that same thing. Placebo, Jerry Sanacora, I don't know if you ever had him on, but you should get him on talking about placebo.
We should. He's a friend. And
he's dedicating the rest of his life to this because, he was a total ketamine guy, and he became utterly convinced
he's the ketamine guy,
that placebo was the king, right? So
Yeah. Well, I'd love to hear what he has to say, sure. The other question then is, with microdosing, is do we have to worry about what Steve's concerned about, which is the valvulopathy? Because these drugs are a little promiscuous at serotonin receptors, and it's 5-HT2B, of course, that we're talking about.
Absolutely.
So,
yes. Yes, we got to worry about that, right? I mean, if you're gonna worry somewhere in psychedelic land, that's where you should worry. I mean, I remember fen. That thing was a miracle, man. Boom, right? So
I'd prescribed it, and then I ended up having to do a deposition with some high-powered lawyers around it. So
yeah, I know. No.
Absolutely.
So that is a problem with microdosing. And Steve, you mentioned that. I mean, you said something we just blew over, Steve, but it's one of the key unanswered questions in the high-dose field, which is, okay, so you do it, you have this experience, you feel better for 3 months, and then you start getting depressed again. You're going to come back in, get another dose. Another 3 months, you get another dose. Well, are you gonna do this for the rest of your life? Maybe. I mean, I don't know.
Right.
But it's a key question. Now, would 8 hours of an experience with a high dose cause valvulopathy if you did it 3 times a year? Maybe not. Would taking a little bit every day? Yeah, maybe.
Yes.
So it's
we don't know the dose response effect either.
No,
low dose may not be the valvulopathy.
It may not be enough to put you over the thing. Yeah, no, we don't know.
That all needs to be worked out. But in some ways, this is like ketamine. I mean, ketamine, we know you have to keep giving it at intervals, and what those intervals are may not be as clear here.
Correct.
There's also we didn't talk about, of course, the scheduling issue, the licensing issue. These drugs, of course, these drugs were originally developed to be therapeutic or discovered to be therapeutic. And, of course, the politics of the 1960s and 70s intervened and they became scheduled. So they'd have to be descheduled down at least to Schedule 2.
Right.
To be practical in any way. And then I'm concerned about this, something Steve mentioned, the standardization of these supportive or psychotherapeutic protocols, because I am worried about the Wild West going on like we have with ketamine clinics right now. It's kind of the Wild West. So there are a number of issues here.
Oh, absolutely, man. And it's unclear, I think what the FDA will do in terms of wanting to see that. The FDA's they're all twisted up because, they approve drugs. They don't approve psychotherapy. So is it just for safety? How do we think about this? I agree with Steve. There's how these are going to be commercialized, how they're going to be administered. And if they require this sort of intensive sort of clinical support, how they're going to be scalable. These are really big issues.
Yeah, and then who standardizes these protocols? Is there some kind of central regulatory body that gives you a certification to be a supportive therapist or whatever? Of course.
We don't know yet.
So the question is, as Steve said, the second-generation psychedelics are a lot more obvious how they would get rolled out.
Sure. I mean, if they didn't have behavioral effects, they would be, they'd be like super SSRI, right? I mean, they would fit within how biologic psychiatry, for, whether we could have a whole other talk about its effectiveness or not, but it would fit within the system. right?
Right, and as Steve mentioned, there's abundant evidence that not only psilocybin, but actually some of the antidepressants that we prescribe are direct activators of the TrkB receptor, which is the BDNF receptor. So they almost bypass what we think they're doing and go kind of down directly.
Well, and so you're talking about a paper where they showed that with, I think it was psilocybin, right? Where it has direct TrkB effects also.
That's right.
So, a really interesting thing to do would be if there was just like a TrkB stimulator like crazy, does it cause psychedelic experiences? Well,
that's true too. That would be fascinating.
So, it gets to how do you regulate this? We were touching about and then Jerry Sanacara's interest in the placebo. If we could shape the placebo and it's therapeutic, that's wonderful. I mean, I don't care. Yeah. But I guess the question is, how do you shape it? How do you regulate it? I don't think it's an FDA thing. The FDA is used to taking medicines. FDA doesn't even know how to approve a 2-week medicine for depression, as you saw with the zuranolone trials. Yeah. It's very hard to know how to do anything but a drug you take every day, and you can do relapse prevention studies. There's a certain formula. And there's a certain formula for getting through the over the finish line, which is placebo-controlled studies, which we mentioned. Maybe the placebo is a very powerful treatment, and we don't even know how to do that. So it doesn't open that up. But I actually think that unless it's a chronic daily dosing of a drug that doesn't cause valvulopathy, and doesn't really depend on things that they're not used to regulating, like the way in which you have a setting. But I don't think the FDA does anything that's like that. I don't see it being FDA approved, but I do see that it could go into practice and in a way, and we can learn how to make placebo work better.
Right, if we could harness the power of placebo, that would be terrific.
Oh yeah, that's what I tell you, man.
It works for everything.
Yeah, it's awesome, and it works. Yeah. There's a whole. When I did this infliximab study, my mind was blown. Right, I was like, wow. Yeah. And had I been 10 years, 20 years younger, I might have pivoted and just tried to do placebo, right? I mean, it's a pretty fascinating thing, Yeah. Now, but Steve, I think, the one quibble, I do think the FDA is going to at least approve MDMA, and I think it's going to approve psilocybin. It doesn't want to not approve it. That's totally different than how it ends up in the clinical world is another question. But there's still, some money in the coffers of some of these guys like Compass and, USONA we're still alive and kicking. It may not happen, but the FDA, and I know this because we interact with them, they're scrambling,
They're trying to figure out what to do.
So what about what's the safety of MDMA? I mean, this is very unusual. And maybe there's such a hue and cry. I remember when the first Alzheimer's drug came out, it was mostly approved by the Senate and then by the FDA because there's such pressure for people to get something for Alzheimer's disease. What was the Tacrin, I believe it was? Yeah. And it was fairly toxic, of course, but it maybe worked a little bit. And they actually took, if you remember that trial, they manipulated it such that they did Tacrin open label, and if you responded, then you were double-blind randomized to the trial or not. And then they kind of putting the foot on the scale. So I don't know what's going to happen. So you have ecstasy. You got these pills. Who's going to take them? Who's going to buy them? What pharmacy is going to sell them? What's it going to cost? And what's the regulation around it? And where's the safety assessment study? Where's the 30-day safety in 2 species? Where's the long-term the Ames test? Where's the the idea of the safety over periods of time with chronic treatment? Are they going to just blow that all off?
No. So you should get in. You should get an Amy from the MAPS public. Have you talked to the MAPS people? They've done all this, Steve. It's pretty crazy. Oh no, it's a whole development. They've hundreds of millions of dollars. No. They just raised like more than $100 million or something like that in a stock offering. Oh no, Amy Emerson. Emerson. She could tell you the whole thing. No, they've done it. They've done long-term follow-up. They've done everything. The FDA is making them do everything. We're all doing everything. It's just like a regular old drug. Tox studies, genotox studies, food effect studies, QT interval studies. Oh yeah, it's all being done.
Well, there are literally, Chuck, to your point, there are literally dozens of companies that are developing some form of psychedelics, and it's really hot. I consult with a number of companies, and they're all asking me about this.
Yeah.
So it's really fascinating.
I know. And, of course, a lot of those companies have gone bust, too, though, to Steve's point.
Some have. Some have, definitely, but there's still plenty of them going on.
I know, there's still plenty, and they're still going.
There's VC and investment money out there. Guys, I got to tell you this story, and Chuck, I'm really curious to hear what you think. A couple months ago, I was in Japan speaking to colleagues about MDD. And one of them said to me, psychedelics will never make it in Japan. I said, well, what do you mean? He said, Japanese people would not want to lose control. They would not want that experience. It would be so dysphoric to them, it would counteract any benefit. So there may be a cultural aspect of this as well.
Yes, of course. And they also didn't want to take antidepressants, right? Isn't it a famous story about paroxetine and the brilliant marketing, and all of a sudden everybody's taking packs? I don't know.
I suspect if they work, that it would change the perception.
This is the thing, right? I mean, so, the desperation out there, and I don't need to tell you gentlemen this.
Right.
It's stunning. Oh, and it is not pretty running these studies. The people call up, this is my last chance, my last hope. I'm going to die if I don't get into your study. Yeah. And then this is really screwed up, because then people think this is going to be a miracle cure, right? And, as Leonard Cohen said, there ain't no cure for love, man. It's not like that. Life is hard. You're not going to take one pill. If you've been depressed for 20, 30 years, the very few people who take one pill are going to live a life of peace, joy, and love afterwards. Life's not like that. It's hard. And if you look at, so if we just sort of look at let's just say that psilocybin, or let's say psychedelics really are essentially a sort of a souped up form of psychotherapy, then, from that perspective, this is taking a psychedelic. It's not the end. It's not like, okay, I've now cut out the cancer. It's like it's the start. It's like old-fashioned start of, okay, now how do I handle my relationships? How do I handle my health? What can I do to enhance my well-being? It's more like an inspiration than a cure, right? It's a totally different thing, So. But that desperation is so intense that when I started this, when I got into this in 15, I'm a little bit edgy, not personally, but I do weird stuff in my research life. And people thought maybe I'd gone too far, And of course, in this case, now we got the opposite problem. I go around telling people, hey, don't oversell this stuff, man. Mm-hmm. This could be whatever the mechanism, this could be a fantastic addition to our armamentarium if we can figure out how to do it. But people think this is going to be the answer to global warming, and
it's not? Oh no!
Because and sadly, there probably is not these things. It's not like that. Well, So the problem we got now is hype, actually, right. And because hype induces then a secondary rejection, right? When it doesn't solve all your problems, you get disillusioned, and then you're
That's right.
bitched out about it, and that's a real problem.
Steve and I did a series on neuroplasticity, and that's where the Joel Dimsdale book, The Dark Persuasion, came in. There's good neuroplasticity, if you will, and there's bad.
Yeah.
And you just made me think these people who've been chronically depressed, they probably wired their brain in a negative way, if you will.
Yeah.
And we talked about PTSD may also be, because neurons that fire together wire together, and substance abuse may also be. Mm-hmm. And so how to control and direct neuroplasticity in a positive way, maybe this is part of what we're doing here.
Well, and it's what we're talking about, right? So one of the interesting things to the second generation, sort of psychedelics that don't produce a psychedelic experience. So let's say, and this woman Guldolan has done this amazing thing where it shows in animals, it opens up kind of a second childhood critical period. So let's say you invent something like this that doesn't have a psychedelic experience, but it's a potent, kabam, inducer of neuroplasticity, so that everything you take in is going to be like childhood, right? Everything's going to matter more, right? So you take it home on Saturday morning, and then Sunday morning something horrible happens. Or you catch your wife in bed with another guy, and instead of you recovering from it, you get PTSD because all of a sudden you're so fresh to the world again that it really, you're right. So nobody's talking about this, but this is if it isn't the case that there are agents that can produce this profound neuroplasticity that opens you up to be available to this sort of change without the experience that presages that change, you got to worry about the experiences afterwards. You may have to put people in the hospital, like a happy place, for 4 or 5 days just to make sure nothing bad happens to them. You know? So this is what's great about this stuff, though. You got to admit, I mean, whatever you think, it's pretty darn interesting, right?
It sure is. It sure is. Well, I think we have to respect the fact that these substances have been used for centuries. Mm-hmm. You know, I always say people vote with their feet. If this wasn't doing something, people would not have continued to do this and to incorporate it into religious ceremonies and things like that. There's something here.
Oh, absolutely. Right? So another way of thinking about what I do is that I'm basically trying to retrofit ancient practices as to see what promise they have as antidepressants. Because, you know, the other thing we've done is hyperthermia, heat. Right?
Yes.
So heat looks like it's going to be an antidepressant, right? And people have been using heat forever, man. I mean, you know, it's a thing, right? Mm-hmm. And, you know, we've got some data from animals and one of our human studies that there are these clear biologic effects. There's an immune signal. In animal models, there's a really interesting skin to brain neural signal. You know, that when you heat people, it works as an antidepressant because it's like a deep brain stimulator, right? So I think that what happened is across time, as humans became more and more intelligent and conscious, they stumbled upon things that had immediate effects that were behaviorally relevant, right? You know, you accidentally eat a psychedelic and you know something happened. You know, you have a sweat lodge and you go, oh, I feel different, you know. All these things are sort of adaptive stressors. Fasting. Like what has religion tended to tap into, right? It taps into these things that have this sort of thing. So this is another way of thinking about what I've been interested in, is trying to see, can we, you know, while we go on to invent the perfect pill, can we maybe pull in some of these other things that people have discovered repeatedly and see if they can be standardized and used as antidepressants?
Steve, maybe that's why you moved to Las Vegas. It's very hot there. Maybe that's helped your mood.
Yeah, but it could be that, or the cynical part of me could be about taxes, but we won't talk about that. It's probably the heat.
Probably the heat. It wouldn't be the taxes. It wouldn't be the taxes if it was me. It would definitely be the heat, right?
Well, Chuck, you have been pushing the envelope for a long time, my friend, and you have done some really, really interesting work, and I want to really thank you and commend you for what you're doing.
Yeah, I think you're one of the field's greatest out-of-the-box thinkers, and we admire what you do, and it's always fun to engage with you and provocative. By the way, I don't believe anything that I say. I'm just saying it to see what your response is.
Yeah, exactly. No. Maybe I don't believe what I'm saying either, Steve. You never know.
I'm pretty sure that's the case.
No, I got to tell you, Chuck, Steve's been saying this for a while. It's not just for you. So.
No, I've heard rumors that he had his doubts, but I get it.
No, it's interesting. Well, I'm sure you're also aware of the case report that Roger published, which is very fascinating, about the guy that they gave psilocybin to. He had no psychedelic experience. He was pissed because all the other people got the psychedelic experience. And then weeks later, he said, oh, I forgot to tell you, I didn't stop my trazodone, which is blocking 5-HT2A.
Yeah.
So that's certainly provocative, but it's an N of one. And
yes.
And I wonder if it's not all of the above. Why can't these drugs be used in a variety of ways in a variety of settings, just like we use antidepressants? There isn't one standard way we give antidepressants. So why not? And for someone who is more psychologically minded, if they want to get the full experience, fine.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yes, of course, that's what I actually think, you know. Yeah. And I actually, if you made me say what I really think, I mean, at this point, what I really think is that these agents induce immediate, powerful changes in brain activity that must be setting something else in motion. Mm-hmm. Whether those changes, you know, whether they just induce these, you know, whether there's like a hand in glove thing that you can't get to change without the experience, don't know, right? But clearly, you know, they must be then inducing sort of longer-term neuroplastic effects that are either driving or cementing, you know, if it was the experience. And yeah, so I certainly think it's going to turn out to be both.
I want to ask you quickly, you keep using the word experience, the power of experience. I was taught that psychotherapy is a biologic treatment, that every experience you have changes your brain chemistry and wiring. And psychotherapy is, and they call it reparenting, whatever, is a way to maybe induce this positive neuroplasticity. Mm-hmm. So the power of experience, even the power of the IV saline you were talking about, that's a powerful experience to get an IV treatment.
Absolutely. Right? Well, with a crash cart, because every once in a while people like go into anaphylactic shock with infliximab. Oh, absolutely. Experience is biological. So I become obsessed with this colleague of mine's work, a guy named Giulio Tononi, who has a thing called integrated information theory. Very controversial, but he's one of the world's kind of leading consciousness guys. And that's one of the implications of that theory, is that experience is a physical, that experience is physical, basically, right? Yeah. And I think that's, so experience is biological, right? And psychotherapy, if it works, it's got to be biological, right? Because the realm of the biological, the realm of the physical is the realm of causal activity. Physical things cause. Right, and information is physically instantiated, right? So even information, you can't have information without a physical instantiation. I mean, Aristotle realized that. So absolutely, it's definitely, even if it turns out that somehow we figure out how to actually show that you can't get the biology without the experience, all that means is that those two are the flip sides of the same coin.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well said.
What a way to end. I believe that says it all.
There you go.
He lifted his skirts and showed us what he really thought.
Oh, please don't tell people what I really think. That I like to keep people guessing.
Yes.
But yeah, you busted me.
Yeah. Well, we have come to the end, and boy, Chuck, you're right. We could talk all day about some of these issues, and I really want to thank you again. Are there any other final kinds of unanswered questions or
there's a billion unanswered questions, but I think we've done a nice job of covering. I mean, this is kind of an interesting conversation because we've gone from the very practical, like how can you possibly commercialize this stuff, to the meaning of the universe. So I think we've done
the metaphysical. Yeah,
exactly.
Steve, any final comments?
No, I very much enjoyed it. I think this is a way in which you have to suspend your disbelief and be open-minded, and magic happens once new data come in that aren't explained, and then we try to find an explanation.
As Roger McIntyre is fond of saying, these are all testable hypotheses. So
that's right.
We will it, and there's a lot of data being generated, and Chuck, you are at the forefront of generating a lot of this, so thank you very much. And I want to thank you, the audience, for taking the time to think with us about some of these complicated issues. I want to thank you for listening, and certainly for more of our offerings, please go to our website at NEIglobal.com, where you can hear other podcasts in the Psychopharmastahlogy series, and you can also see our other educational offerings. So thanks very much, guys. Take care.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of the NEI Podcast. Please let us know what you'd like to hear more about by leaving a review. Don't miss another episode. Subscribe today. For more information about NEI and our premier educational content, please visit NEIglobal.com.